Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and thank you for participating in today's 378th webinar, Self-Care for Justice Professionals. This webinar will discuss the impact that trauma work has on the brain and body, and will present interventions that a person can do to mitigate these effects. The presentation will also discuss the personality types that are drawn to trauma work and working with other people's trauma, and the self-care interventions appropriate for them. The webinar will conclude with guidance on developing a personalized self-care plan. Our presenter for today is no stranger to our Justice Clearinghouse audience. Dwayne Bowers is a licensed professional counselor and educator and a certified clinical hypnotherapist in private practice. He is the father of Guiding Your Family Through Loss and Grief and A Child is Missing, providing support for the families of missing children. As a therapist, Dwayne's specialty is working with survivors of trauma and traumatic loss, child exploitation and trafficking, which includes providing support to families of abducted, missing, exploited, trafficked, and murdered victims, as well as professional staff working directly in the field. Dwayne is responsible for the development of support, clinical supervision, and training of staff and volunteers for a variety of organizations that deal with these issues in both the U.S. and Canada. Dwayne also provides wellness supports to the Trust and Safety Division of Tumblr and Yahoo, the Maryland State Police Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force, the Alexandria City Police Investigators, and many others by creating and facilitating training and support and wellness programs for the staff members. And now, briefly, before we begin, I'd like to share with you some information about the Justice Clearinghouse. The Justice Clearinghouse is the only peer-to-peer educational program for justice professionals that emphasizes the multidisciplinary nature of an effective justice system. Through our year-round virtual conference, our audience and subscribers begin to develop a comprehensive understanding of the system while breaking down many of the misconceptions. While our events are free to attend live, our paid subscribers do receive 24/7 access to recorded webinars and are eligible to receive certificates of attendance that may be used when seeking continuing education credits. If you're not presently a subscriber, I'd invite you to join today and support our work. Now, the last few things I'd like to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded, and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes, and it will be available to subscribers on the Justice Clearinghouse website. Second, this is a listen-only event, but you can type in any questions you have through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll take as many of those questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. Next, if you experience audio issues during the webinar, such as the sound cutting in and out intermittently, consider dialing in using the telephone number included in your emailed invite. And when the system asks for a PIN, you can bypass that by hitting the pound key. Now, we have incorporated several polling questions into this webinar. You'll need to have access to your keyboard and mouse to participate. And just by way of a trial run, I'd actually like to ask the first question, which is, what time zone are you in? Are you in Eastern Time, Central Time, Mountain Time, or Pacific Time? Or perhaps you're outside of the continental United States and need to indicate other. Thank you so much for participating. This really does help us understand exactly what times end up working best for our audience for our webinars. And I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll. Thank you so much for participating, and just share with you that 40% of you are from the Eastern Time Zone, 19% from Central, 20% from Mountain, 18% from Pacific, and 3% seem to be outside of the continental United States. Thanks again for participating. Finally, after today's webinar, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback helps us shape pretty much everything that we do here at the Justice Clearinghouse. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to you. Dwayne, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Aaron. And I think all I can say is the longer the resume, the longer you've been around. I think it's just a sign of age rather than so much experience. So thank you, Aaron, for that. And welcome, everybody. My name's Dwayne, and we're going to talk about self-care for justice professionals, professionals in the justice system. But I want to define first, what is the difference between self-care and wellness? Because people use those words interchangeably, and they're really not appropriate. Self-care is what we all should be already doing. We all should be taking care of ourselves. And what that means is we should be doing things that are helping us to deal with, number one, stress, and to help our body and brain connection work effectively. So anything that is stress management, anything that is the basics like exercise, like rest, like relaxation, good nutrition, those are things that we are responsible for. We are responsible to do that for ourselves and be doing that in a consistent way. But wellness is looking beyond the stress management, looking beyond the body-brain connection, and it's looking at the full person, particularly if they are in an environment that is considered adverse. In other words, working in an environment of trauma. We need to look more than just at stress management. Excuse me. We need to look at not only the body and the mind, but the emotions and spirit, if for lack of a better word, the other intangible parts of ourselves. And it's also helpful that if we are in this kind of adverse environment, that environment also helps to support our wellness. So in other words, it's a good idea if your employer also has some kind of a wellness program that helps support you if you are working with trauma and the environment is an adverse one in that kind of way. So self-care is the basics, the stuff we should be doing ourselves. Wellness is looking at the full person, your full self, even the way you think and that sort of thing, to make sure that you are maintaining your full wellness as you work in an environment that may be adverse, may be exposing you to trauma. I thought it was important to define what do we call a traumatic event? What is traumatic? And so I thought I'd look to the government, to the U.S. government, to see if any agency had a list of what they considered to be traumatic. And SAMHSA did. The Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration has this list of what they consider to be traumatic. So not only do I want you to look at this in terms of the work that you do, but I'd also like you to look at this in terms of what do you bring to your work? There's some statistics that actually say people who consistently work in trauma, about 85% of them actually do that work because of their own personal experience with trauma, whether they themselves have experienced trauma or someone close to them has experienced trauma. And so what are you bringing to the work that may already have you in a traumatic response mode, and then you add the work on top of that. And as you look through this list, there's no real surprises. You know, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. One of the things I do want you to look at is historical trauma. We are, through epigenetics, we are learning that your environment does have an impact on the way that your genes use protein in your brain to build neural networks. And what that means is your environment affects the way that your brain is physically built. So if your environment is traumatic, it will actually affect the way those proteins are used to build the neurons and build the neural networks in your brain. And then that gets encoded in your DNA and gets passed on from generation to generation. Just an aside, the research is showing that a child that is sexually or physically abused has 12 times the epigenetic changes in their brain as someone who's not. And those epigenetic changes actually then get passed on to the next generation. So while we don't know, the research doesn't know exactly what that means yet, it does say that historical trauma does get passed on from generation to generation, and there is some influence in the way that the brain is constructed because of that. Then we go on and look at, and notice that some of these say victim of or witness to, and that kind of indicates secondary trauma, which we're going to spend some time talking about. When we look at military trauma, I want you to not just think in terms of war-related trauma, but we know that in our own troops, and the figures go anywhere from 70 to 85% of females in active duty, actually their trauma in the military is sexual abuse, sexual assault by their own troops. So when we think of military trauma, we can't just stop with thinking of war-related trauma. Traumatic grief or separation, and then system-induced trauma. And what does that mean? Looking at any system that we have that perpetuates perhaps an ism, such as sexism or homophobia or racism or an ism against a particular ethnic origin or religion that the system actually treats them differently, can be construed as a system-induced trauma. So what do you come with? What do you bring to your work that may already have you in, like I said, experiencing perhaps a traumatic response, which we will explain shortly. Just want you to have an idea of what do we consider a traumatic event. If an event is considered traumatic, then it usually involves a traumatic picture. In other words, you have an image in your head that represents that trauma. And you didn't even have to see the trauma. You will create the image based on information you hear, information you read. You will create the picture yourself from this traumatic event, and that will become the representation for you. The interesting thing about the picture is that your body responds to the picture as if it was real. Think about this. Go to a slasher movie. Good guys walking through the door, bad guys behind the door with the knife. The knife comes down. What does your body do? Your body jumps. But it's a movie. You know it's a movie. It's not real. But to your brain, those images, it responds to them as if they're real. Same with the images you create in your head. That's why we have traumatic response. Every time you recognize that image, your body responds to it as if it's real. The event has to be considered sudden or unexpected. So in other words, if it's sudden and I didn't expect it, that's one quality, but it could even be something that I expected to happen. I just didn't know when. I knew there was a possibility that this event was going to happen. I didn't know when. And so I will respond in a traumatic way to that as well. It can be considered forceful or violent and perceived as overwhelming. Or uncontrollable, and you're going to find that control is one of the keys. If we feel we have no control over a situation, that's one of the three elements of causing a traumatic response. And it helps me, or as a result of this event, I have feelings of helplessness, lack of safety, lack of control. It's interesting, there was a poll done or research done with victims of personal trauma, such as rape, such as domestic violence. And once it was over, they were asked, what is the thing you fear the most now that your traumatic event is over? And of course, the researchers expected them to say, I'm afraid that the event will happen again. What they said was 85% said what they were most afraid of was how people would look at them being victims of this kind of trauma. So the shame, the lack of safety may not be so much that I'm afraid the event's going to happen again, or I'm afraid physically. I'm afraid of how people will now look at me now that I have been a victim of this trauma. And I want you to think about your work, especially in an environment that may be testosterone driven, where if you were to say, you know, this really is upsetting me, or this is really bothering me, or this image is in my head from this case that I'm working on, you may actually not get support, but get exactly the opposite. Be made fun of, or be actually held accountable in a negative way for showing that sign of, quote, weakness, unquote. So I have the first poll question here, and I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to set up the poll for this question.
You bet, Dwayne. So the first question is can the effects of trauma be cumulative? And the possible responses are yes or no. And I'll be very interested in seeing how the audience responds. I'll although I probably will close it down in about 5 minutes because it is a unanimous vote so far here, Dwayne.
Okay.
I've never seen this. 100% of the audience indicated yes.
Yeah, absolutely
And
right.
so, go ahead, Dwayne.
No, absolutely right. It can be cumulative. And what I hope you're understanding from that is what that means is if I'm exposed to more than one trauma, the effects of that multiple traumas add to the one before, the one before, the one before. And so I build and build. So if those multiple traumas are the same trauma over and over again, my traumatic response is greater and greater and greater each time. Or if I'm exposed to several different trauma, my body and my brain respond in an additive way to each of those. So absolutely, great audience. So what I wanted to do to back that up is to talk about those of us in the mental health world. We have this book we call the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. That's the DSM. And that's every mental health diagnosis that is accepted in the United States is contained in that book, and it's given a code number. We put that code number on our insurance forms to get paid. So here's the deal. If it's not in the book, and if we can't get paid for it, it doesn't exist, okay? So interesting thing about post-traumatic stress disorder is we didn't have a diagnosis of actually PTSD until the Vietnam War. Before then, it was in World War I, it was referred to as shell shock. In World War II, it was something like complex combat, a combat stress reaction. And then after World War II, it was referred to as gross stress reaction. And it wasn't until after the Vietnam War that we referred to it as PTSD. We did a diagnosis, or we created a diagnosis in 1980 based on what we saw in the Vietnam War, and that's the diagnosis we used up until 2012. The problem with that diagnosis was it was war-related, and it was really hard to use for personal trauma, such as domestic violence and rape and those kinds of trauma. And so in 2012, they actually rewrote it and created a new diagnosis. Up until 2012, if you didn't see the event, then you couldn't have a diagnosis of PTSD. You had to actually see the event happen either to someone else or to you. And if you didn't see it, it wasn't PTSD. Now look at the exposure. Now it says you either witnessed it or you learned about it happening to someone else. But then I want you to look at this last paragraph here, that you witness or experience repeated adversive details of the event. Now, the two examples they gave in the DSM for this, number one was law enforcement personnel who are constantly exposed to stories of sexual child abuse, or people who clean up crime scenes. In each case, they did not see the actual event. They were just exposed to the adversive details of the event. So I want you, all of you, to think about this in reference to you and the job that you do. Most of you are being exposed to repeated aversive details of traumatic events that occur to your clients or to the victims that you're working with, or whatever that population is. And so over and over and over again, it is cumulative, and it does have an impact on you. It does have an impact on the way your brain works, and an impact on the way that your body responds to the way your brain works. And you'll notice I tried to make it pretty, and you probably can't even read it, so we'll just move on. The other criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder is avoidance behavior, re-experiencing behavior. Avoidance would mean I'm trying to do everything I can to not think about it, not be triggered, etc. Re-experiencing would be like dreams, nightmares, flashbacks that I don't have control over that keep reminding me of it. Negative cognition is sort of, I develop a negative worldview as a result of this. And hypervigilance, I expect it to happen again. I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. Each of these things has 5 or 6 criteria that have to be met. But I just wanted to give you a general overview of what is PTSD. And my guess is none of you, or 99% of you, do not have PTSD, and that's a good thing. But here's what I want you to understand. You have normal, I've got my left hand stretched out, and then you've got PTSD, I have my right hand stretched out, all right? That's all we have as far as diagnosis for trauma in the mental health world. Normal, PTSD, the two extremes. But if this is additive, if it's cumulative, if more and more exposure to trauma helps build you toward PTSD, what do you call that area in between normal and PTSD? And we refer to that area as traumatic response. Your body, your brain is responding to the trauma that you are experiencing, be it secondhand, be it firsthand, whatever, but you're not, your response isn't great enough to be considered post-traumatic stress disorder. So when I talk about traumatic response, I'm talking about that area between normal and PTSD. And this is the area that most of us find ourselves in. This is the area we actually have some control over, as you will see as we go through this. So trauma can be the result of a single event, that can happen to us and cause, a traumatic reaction or even PTSD, or it can come from an accumulation of being exposed to aversive details of many events, or the same event over and over and over again. What I'd like you to understand is, so this affects us cognitively. Now, cognitively is the way the brain works, emotionally, how we feel, physically, and we're going to see how your body actually changes as a result of trauma, and mentally, and this is the thoughts that you have. So it changes the brain not only in the way the brain works, but it also changes your perception and the way you think about things. So it's not just, an emotional response here. It actually affects us in a variety of ways. So we talked about, excuse me, traumatic response. And these are the symptoms then of someone who is having a traumatic response. This is, you don't have PTSD, you're not normal, you're somewhere in the middle. You've been exposed to enough trauma that your body is starting to respond to it, your brain's starting to respond to it. And those of you that have been at your work for some period of time, I'd like you to think back 2 years. Just think back 2 years and ask yourself, could I concentrate better 2 years ago than I do now? Was my memory better? Could I learn new information better 2 years ago than I can now? Repetitive thinking is sort of a nickname for that is monkey brain, where particularly just before you go to sleep, you're laying in the bed, you're just about to go to sleep, and then suddenly this thought pops up. And then it goes to another and another, and it goes around in a loop, and that loop keeps going round and round and round all night. You try to shut it down, and it just keeps going round and round and round. That's repetitive thinking. Does that happen to you more now than it did 2 years ago? Do you notice that you get angry more often and that your anger is kind of out of proportion to the stimulus? Maybe you're overreacting anger-wise more now than you did 2 years ago? Do you have more of a negative worldview? Do you see the world more as a negative place now than you did perhaps 2 years ago? Are you expecting the world to be more negative? Are you expecting negative things to happen more than you did 2 years ago? Are you having more trouble sleeping? And then I want you to look at your immune system. I want you to think about, do you catch more colds, for example, than you did 2 years ago? Does it take longer to get over them? Do you feel more pain than you did 2 years ago? Does it take longer for scratches or bruises to heal than it did 2 years ago? Your immune system, the reason I said pain, your immune system generates a painkiller. And as we get stressed, as we move more and more toward that PTSD, as we become more and more ingrained in this traumatic response, our immune system gets compromised and it stops generating that painkiller, and we start feeling pain more. And think about when you get really, really, really stressed, where do you start feeling that? Do you start feeling pain in your neck and in your back and your shoulders and that sort of thing? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that maybe that pain was already there, but the immune system was masking it with the painkiller, and now that you are highly stressed and it's not producing the pain killer anymore, you're starting to feel this. Do you feel, we're looking at dissociation now, do you often feel, more than 2 years ago, do you feel that sometimes you just don't fit, that you just don't fit in the world anymore, that it's just, I just don't get it. I just don't see why people are reacting so strongly to these things that I don't think are so important. I just don't fit so much anymore. Do you find that you just withhold your feelings more often? I'm just not going to let myself feel about this stuff anymore. I don't want to get hurt. I don't want to put a lot of emotional energy into that. I'm just going to pull myself back from this. And the depression associated with the traumatic response is different than clinical depression. I'm not talking about a sadness kind of depression. I'm talking about motivation. Do you find it's harder to get yourself motivated to do things, even things that you really love to do? You just can't, it's not even energy. You just can't make the connection between I want to do this and actually doing it. Do you find that's happening more now than it did 2 years ago, if you've been at this business for a while? And so here's what I want you to think about. Look at this list. And if you've got 2 or 3 of these things that, yeah, it's happening more than it did 2 years ago, it kind of comes and goes, though it's not really consistent, yeah, welcome to the world. You're a human being. But if you've got 4 or more of these that you can say, yeah, that happens to me and it's pretty consistent, that indicates that you're having a traumatic response. Now that's okay. It's not a terminal diagnosis. We can actually deal with this. We can actually reduce it. And you're going to see how. But recognize it. Be open and be honest with yourself to be able to say, yeah, I see these things happening, because what you're saying is, yeah, my job is affecting me. Yes, being exposed to these trauma repeatedly, these details over and over again, is having a toll on me because I can see it in my behavior. All right. And so what I want you to understand here is all of these things, I'm going to go back to that slide, all of these things, every one of these symptoms is caused by heightened levels of cortisol in the body. Cortisol is known as the stress hormone. It's also known as the aging hormone. It's also supposed to be the cause of the development of central body fat when you hit middle age. You know, none of us have it yet, but when we get older, they say we're going to get this roll of central body fat, and it's going to be caused by cortisol. So cortisol, the hormone, is the root of all of this, and this is how it works. I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, but in the middle of this picture, there is a yellow place. And that yellow place behind it is where the hypothalamus is. And the hypothalamus starts the fight, flight, freeze response. And the fight, flight, freeze response is actually the basis of what we talk about being the traumatic response. And so we start the fight, flight, freeze response from that. So what happens is the hypothalamus, and I'm not going to get into all of the different hormones, but the hypothalamus releases a hormone that stimulates the pituitary gland, which releases a hormone that gets into your blood system and stimulates the adrenal gland, and the adrenal gland releases adrenaline and cortisol. Cortisol then comes through the blood system up to the brain, and the first thing that it does is it shuts down this purple tube right here. You have 2 of these. This is called your hippocampus. This is responsible for short-term memory, learning, concentration, kind of that first 5 or 6 things on that list we just looked at. All right, so that's responsible for it. You have 2 of these, one on each side of the brain. It shuts this down so that this thing, this maroon bulb, which is called the amygdala, can start firing. Now, the amygdala is your fear and anger center. So it starts firing, bam, bam, bam. It's actually what controls the fight, flight, freeze response. So your ability to learn, your ability to think and to reason and whatever starts to get shut down, and you start going into this warning, 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 warning reaction. And this is where hypervigilance, anger, inability to sleep, all of those things that we talked about, the other half of the list, comes from. So usually the hippocampus controls the amygdala, but in trauma, the stronger, let me do it a different way. The more cortisol in the system, the more it will shut this down, and the more the amygdala, the fear and anger center, will take over. All right, so the more you are responding to the traumatic event, the more cortisol in your system, the more you will see all those symptoms. The stronger they will be, the more intense they will be. All right. And so let me just give you an example of how this works. The hippocampus normally controls the amygdala, or at least helps to mitigate it. So, last November or so, I did a kind of a retreat for families of missing persons in Minnesota, and it was in a retreat center, which had a lake, and we all had kind of cabins that had windows that looked over the lake and whatever. But it was in November because this organization, which was very small, could get it for free. And so I'm in my room and I'm looking out my window, and I started to realize that, it was kind of cold and November-y and no leaves and whatever. It's kind of gray. And I'm looking out there and I said, Jason could live here. Jason could live here. And I started going, okay, Dwayne, slow down. Okay, here's my hippocampus. Slow down, Dwayne. You know you can go down a rabbit hole. You know you can drive yourself crazy with this kind of thinking. Shut it down. So my hippocampus is trying to control my amygdala. And my amygdala is going, well, it could. And my hippocampus is saying, it's a movie. It isn't real, but it could be. All right. So my hippocampus says, okay, let's end this once and for all. As long as your door is locked, as long as your sliding door is locked, you're safe. So I reached down and I pulled the door and it comes open. The lock is broken. Okay, my amygdala is going to town. See, he set it up this way. Jason's going to get us. It's not safe. Help, And so my hippocampus is going, chill. You know what we can do? We can move the dresser over, put it right in the track of the door so you can't open the door. You're fine. Go to move the dresser is bolted to the wall. Now my amygdala is really taking off. Oh my God, we're gonna die. And so finally my hippocampus says, you know what? We're in the woods. There are sticks on the ground. Go out and get a stick and put it in the door. And my amygdala went, oh, okay. That's the relationship between the hippocampus and the amygdala. And so once the cortisol shuts down the hippocampus, your amygdala is really firing. The fear, the anger, all of those negative ones, the negative worldview, expecting negative things to happen. All of those things start to take over as your hippocampus is shut down. So, let me go back to that picture. So another thing to understand is that's what happens when cortisol hits the brain, but and it also shuts down the immune system. The theory is that when the immune system is shut down, the reason it's shut down is because you're going into a traumatic response. The body says, I don't need to be wasting energy here trying to fight a cold. I need to work on this traumatic response. I need to respond to this cortisol. And so it shuts down the immune system to save energy. And when everything is all over, cortisol is supposed to encourage the brain to go back to normal. But if you're having if you keep having these images in your head of your case, if you keep having those pictures, or you keep having a new case with new trauma, it eventually just doesn't shut down. It just stays active. The cortisol never goes back and shuts down the system and puts it back to normal. So what do we need to do here to take care of this? What do you think is the best way to reduce or eliminate these symptoms that we looked at? And there are your choices. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron again.
You bet. Folks, and I apologize for the typo there. I just saw it as the polling question came up. What is the best way to reduce or eliminate the symptoms of traumatic response, mental health counseling, reducing the cortisol level, or both? And we'll leave that one open for just a few minutes. These are the kind of typos that spell check doesn't fix, right?
I'm sorry for that. I didn't even see it.
No worries. I didn't either. I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll and share the results. Dwayne, 89% indicated both, 7% indicated reduce the cortisol level, and 4% indicated mental health counseling. So what is the right answer?
Tell me again how many chose number 2.
Oh, sorry. Let's see. Reducing the cortisol level was 7%.
Okay.
4% indicated mental health counseling.
Yep, they were right. Number 2. If you want to reduce those symptoms, the best way to reduce those symptoms is to reduce the cortisol. So let me talk about this for a second. When I, as a mental health person, am working with somebody who's having a traumatic response, it is the symptoms that are usually the most troublesome. If I can help them mitigate the symptoms, help them reduce the symptoms, then we can work on the trauma. Now, trauma is caused by the meaning and value that you give the event, and that takes the talk therapy, that takes the counseling. And so if I'm going to help you change the perspective you have of this event, then I'm going to talk to you about it. But before we do that, we are going to want to help you to function better, and that is by reducing the symptoms. And the best way to reduce the symptoms is to reduce the cortisol level. It's cortisol that's causing the symptoms. So if we can reduce the cortisol, then the symptoms become eliminated, and then you're in a better place to be able to look at what is the meaning and value you're giving this traumatic event. So reducing cortisol is what we want to do here. And there are a variety of ways that we can reduce cortisol. The number one way to reduce cortisol is to release endorphins into the system. What's the number one way of releasing endorphins into the system? Exercise. I anticipate that all of you are good, consistent exercisers. Yeah, maybe my hopes are a little high, but that's part of good self-care. Exercise actually releases endorphins, which brings down cortisol levels. So that's, and I don't mean pump and iron. I mean just good exercise. It can be walking. It can be simple stuff. The rules are you have to break a sweat, and you want to do it for at least 20 minutes, at least 3 times a week. All right, but you got to break a sweat because that helps to change some of the enzymes that are going on in your system, and helps to release the endorphins even more strongly. So think about it. Those of you that do exercise in a consistent way, when you're stressed and you go to exercise, how do you feel afterwards? I think most of you are probably saying terrific. That list of symptoms that we just looked at, when you exercise, they literally are immediately affected. They are immediately reduced just through exercise. Unfortunately, exercising once in your career isn't going to do it for you. You have to exercise consistently. So that has to be part of your lifestyle, to be able to release endorphins, to bring down the cortisol levels, to mitigate those symptoms. All right. Other ways of reducing cortisol and releasing endorphins: laughter. And even fake laughter, ha 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 ha. I actually just released some endorphins because my brain doesn't know the difference between pretending to laugh and really laughing. Then there's a lot of research that backs that up. Feeling good about yourself. So setting goals, setting achievable goals, and when you achieve them, give yourself an atta-girl, atta-boy, pat yourself on the back, celebrate that you achieved them, feel good about yourself. And being around somebody who nurtures you is another way of releasing endorphins, bringing down cortisol levels. Those are some of the behavioral ways to reduce cortisol and to change those symptoms. There's one other thing you can do. It's actually something that you can take into your body, and that's chocolate. Chocolate actually doesn't release endorphins, but it does help to bring down cortisol levels. So those are some things that you can do, and you can do consistently, and you have full control. So think about this. If you can mitigate these symptoms that we're talking about, you are stopping the progression forward to PTSD, all right? So you have control over whether this goes to a full PTSD diagnosis or not. You have full control over that. It's up to you. Another way to look at the brain is this way. You know that the brain processes what we call bilaterally across both hemispheres, and it processes across this thing here called the corpus callosum, this thing that kind of looks like a fish hook. All right, that's how we process across both lobes of the brain. When we become traumatized, when we start having a traumatic response, we actually start to freeze in right brain. So let's define the two sides of the brain. Left brain is, let's say, logic, mathematics, cause and effect, factual. That's what happens in the left brain. The right brain is more imagination, impression. It is symbolic. It is creative. we start to get trapped in right brain as our cortisol levels go up, as we have more and more of a traumatic response. Well, what's in the right brain? I just said, it's symbolic, it is imagination. It's the traumatic pictures. And so we start to get caught in those pictures. We start to freeze on that side of the brain. So what I want you to understand is you can use your body to unfreeze your brain. Anything you do with both sides of your body will cause the brain to work. Let me do it this way. If I slap my left knee, the right hemisphere of my brain is activated. If I slap my right knee, the left side of my brain is activated. So anything I do that's bilateral, such as walking, using both sides of my body, swimming, cycling, the elliptical, the spinning, the treadmaster, the stairmaster, anything that I do that uses both sides of my body helps to unfreeze my brain and helps get me out of that right brain freezing. And so when you exercise, pumping iron is great for releasing endorphins, but it really doesn't do much to help your brain free up and function better. Make sure that part of your exercise is bilateral, using both sides of your body for a period of time, so that you can unfreeze that right brain. So we're talking about secondary trauma here. We're talking about you are having a reaction to somebody else's trauma and accumulating somebody else's trauma over and over and over again. So that's what we're talking about in secondary trauma. You are having a traumatic response to somebody else's trauma. And I'm going to tell you that this is perfectly normal. One of the reasons it's perfectly normal is because you have in your brain these things called mirror neurons. Mirror neurons, the hypothesis says, we were given mirror neurons so that we could interact well with each other. We could fit in with each other. I'm going to give you a couple of really gross exaggeration examples, but I think you'll get it from this. So let's say you are going to meet a bunch of your friends at the sports bar, all right? And so you walk in the bar and there they are, they're down watching something on TV and they're all, testosteroned up. By the time you get to them, you are all, because your mirror neurons have said, oh, look, that's what they're feeling. I know how that feels. I know how to feel that way. In order to fit in with them, I need to feel that way. So by the time you get there, your body's already starting to testosterone up and get all, and then you get there and you realize they are watching figure skating, all right? Or you're supposed to meet a bunch of friends and you get to wherever it is you're supposed to meet with them and you see them in the corner and they're all sobbing and they're all boo-hooing. By the time you get to them, you will have tears in your eyes. Your body will be ready to have that same reaction so that you fit in. So we have these mirror neurons which allow us to fit in with each other based on what we perceive they are feeling and finding that feeling within ourselves so that when we get to them, we actually can interact. And so when you're working with your client and the client is telling you these stories, your brain naturally wants to find the feeling that's similar to that so that you can connect with them. And so we are hardwired to actually have a traumatic response when we're dealing with somebody who has experienced trauma. So it is normal for us to have these reactions. And that's kind of what I want you to get the feel of. People tend to think, oh, well, I must be weak or whatever because I'm picking up on these feelings and I can't control my feelings when I'm talking to someone. No, it's normal. You're doing what your brain is hardwired to do. So be aware of that. So the longer you are in service, the longer you are doing the job you are doing, the more you learn skills that will allow you to kind of overcompensate for your mirror neurons so that you can control the mirror neuron reaction. But here's some of the things that you can get trapped into. So for your client, when they experience trauma, there are three main characteristics. They feel like they have no control, they are not safe, and that they're not being heard. If you start to connect too much with your client, to have this secondary trauma response, you start feeling those things for them. You start putting yourself in a position where you start saying, oh my God, she feels like she has no control. I know how that feels. I know how it feels to not feel safe. I know how it feels. You're starting to click in the mirror neurons to what you're perceiving that person is feeling, and you start to connect with that too. Well, as soon as you're starting to feel those three feelings, even though it's not for your own situation, as soon as you start clicking into those feelings, you're now having a traumatic response, all right? You're experiencing those things, not for yourself, but for your client. So you're hardwired to do it, and then you start clicking into the three key elements of the traumatic response that they are having. Another way to look at this is through levels of empathy. I attended a conference last summer put on by the Australian Embassy here in Washington, D.C. And they invited law enforcement leaders from all over the world to come talk about what kind of care programs do you have for your staff? What kinds of things are you doing for your staff? And it was interesting. The United Kingdom talked about this. They talked about rather than looking at your traumatic response and using scientific terms, they used the terms of empathy, and they said, we look at what level of empathy is the officer or is the staff member experiencing in this situation, and we work from there. So a cognitive level of empathy is when you say, gee, that must be tough. Boy, look at what happened to that victim. That's got to be tough. That's got to be hard to live with. She's got a lot of stuff coming up. He's got a lot of stuff coming up as a result of this. That's kind of a normal response. It's cognitive. It's all coming from your head. The next level is starting to feel it, saying, oh my goodness, you know, that's what I was describing before. She's feeling like she has no control. I know how that feels. Now we're starting, this is an okay level to be at, but we're starting to get really close to that line of secondary trauma by doing this. When we do that to the point that we now change our behavior, it's considered compassionate. In other words, if this client, you're now saying, oh my God, he or she doesn't feel like they have control, they don't think anybody's hearing them, I'm going to do something about this. And you start treating this case differently than any other case. You start making this case more important. You start connecting to this case more strongly than any other case. You are in trouble. You are definitely experiencing secondary trauma from this case, and you are in beyond. You have crossed over good professional boundaries. You have gotten in too deep at this point. And so these are different ways of looking at the same thing, of how connected are you to the client and how much is it causing a traumatic response in you. So once you have compassionate level of empathy for a client, you are full in, you are fully experiencing those symptoms we talked about and having a traumatic response, high levels of cortisol, etc., going on in your body. Now, how do you know if you're not? Some of the things to look at yourself to make sure that you're not over-connecting are these things. So how are you relating to other cases? Are you spending more time on this one case than the others? Yeah, well, that's a warning. So making sure that you're spending equal amount of time on all your cases, or make sure that in your private life, you're connecting to people outside of work, not all work-related people, but that you have a good social network on the outside, that you're relating to others. One of the things we do when we get too involved is we start to withdraw. We start to not socialize so much. We start to be so focused on this case or so focused on our work, and that's a warning sign. Are we seeing new possibilities? In other words, do we take risks? Do we look at, you know what, I need to do something completely different than the job. Let me go do something different. Let me go jump out of an airplane. Let me go scuba diving. Let me do something that maybe has a risk, something that, is there something new I can do to separate from this? Or is there a new possibility in this case? Can I find new ways of coping positively and still be engaged in this case? Can I introduce some mindfulness techniques we're going to talk about, that sort of thing. Do you recognize the amount of strength that you have? In other words, when we get really involved in a case and we start taking on the feelings, we start almost feeling like the victim. We need to recognize our own personal strength, that no, this is not happening to me. And yes, I do have a voice. And yes, I do have control. And yes, I am safe. And I need to separate those feelings out. They are not mine. I am personally well and strong. Is there a change in what fulfills you or in the amount of time that you're taking to be fulfilled? That's kind of what I use as spiritual. What do you do that fulfills you? And are you spending time doing that? Or have you shut that down completely as you're getting involved in this case? And as you see this case and it's affecting you, are you noticing that it's changing the way you're perceiving the world? Is it changing the priorities in your life? And are you seeing life differently now that you've separated from this case and you know, hey, I got sucked in really easy on that. I need to set some things up to make sure that doesn't happen to me again. So we're up to another polling question. And so I'm going to, again, turn this over to Aaron.
You bet, Dwayne. The question is there are people who do not experience a traumatic response while they are involved in a traumatic event. Is that statement true or is it false? And we'll give folks about 10 seconds to respond. I also want to encourage you, we have about 10 minutes left in the formal presentation. Well, I did want to encourage you to submit any questions that you have for Dwayne. I like your little laugh there, Dwayne.
I just glanced at the clock and went, oh my God, 10 minutes. Yep.
All right, so maybe we have about 15 minutes or so. And I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll and share the results. Dwayne, 75% indicated that the statement is correct. 75% said it was correct. 25% said that it is false. What is the right answer?
And that is true. There are people who have a personality type who are drawn to doing trauma work who actually function better doing trauma work than anything else. These folks are called sensation-seeking personalities, or people with high sensation-seeking personalities. And you know, unfortunately, in our history, we've looked at people like this, and I'll take special ops folks or law enforcement or whatever. We've often looked at people who put themselves in risk as sort of adrenaline junkies. That was the nickname we used to give them. And what we have found from research is it's exactly the opposite. People who are sensation-seeking personalities, their adrenaline level and their cortisol levels are actually very low when they're working with trauma. They are in their zone. They are doing what they do best. Their dopamines and their endorphins are high, but cortisol and adrenaline is actually pretty low. This is where they belong. This is what they do best. Excuse me, and there's kind of 4 levels of this. I'm just going to do the first 2. The first one is someone who actually puts themselves at physical risk. And again, like I said, these are people that you may find in special operations or in law enforcement sometimes. People who tend to gravitate to jobs that not only is there trauma involved, but it's high risk to them as well. These people tend to stay at their jobs a long time. They tend to constantly try to improve their own performance. And they function best in this environment. But where they get in trouble is when they get bored. When boredom comes, they get in trouble. This is when the traumatic response starts. So this would be, you know, when maybe they're between cases, or they're having to do the paperwork, or maybe they're sitting waiting for weeks and weeks waiting to testify in court or whatever. When they get bored is their high risk area. This is when the traumatic response starts. And just an aside, this is also when there are highest risks for self-destructive behavior, because when they're bored, they're looking for that feeling again that they get when they're working with trauma, and may actually turn to drugs, alcohol, even over exercising becoming an addiction, shopping, gambling, those kinds of things that gives them a thrill that kind of gives them that same feeling as to when they are actually working in trauma. The second is experience seeking. This is kind of what I am. These are folks who want to try everything once that's related to working with trauma. And so what they do is they find themselves in a job that's trauma related, and they do very well. They get great reviews, they get great evaluations, they get promoted very quickly. And after about 4 years, they kind of wake up one morning and go, okay, done this, time to move on. It's not that there's anything wrong with the job. It's not that there's anything wrong with their performance. It's just, all right, I've done this. Time to move on. And they become very frustrated if they make themselves stay for a period of time. Well, this is me. And I often wondered why I never held a job more than 4 or 5 years working for somebody else. Well, it was because of this very thing. And so now working for myself, I can control changing my what I'm doing and keeping myself entertained. So these folks tend to change jobs. They work very well. They tend to change jobs every so often to different trauma work. Um, but they get in trouble again when they get bored. And so I'll go to the next one too. The next one is somebody who functions really well, who looks like they're doing a really good job in the trauma work. But when it comes to doing reports or doing paperwork or whatever, they don't consider that important. They consider that minutia, and so they kind of refuse to do that. They will do the trauma work, but they won't do the backup stuff. And so at first they look really great, but then eventually they're starting to get written up because they're not doing the backup work, and they don't really care. They only want to do the trauma stuff. And when they're just about to the point that they're going to get fired, suddenly they've got a new job somewhere else doing the same thing. So you all may know somebody like that. So again, these folks, including myself, were drawn to the trauma work. We function really well in the trauma work, but when we get bored, look out. That's when we start being at risk. And so here's the statistics. Like I said, hormones, cortisol is low. Actually, adrenaline is low, but the dopamines and the endorphins are very high when we are working in trauma. We have a high risk for addiction. If we were kids, actually some of the new research is showing as kids you were either teacher's little pet or you were a person who, when you got bored, you just got up and walked around and carried on your own conversations regardless of what the teacher was doing, which is what I did. So you were one extreme or the other. If you have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety, for example, and then you are not working in trauma, you're in one of those bored periods, that diagnosis gets even stronger. And we're in trouble when boredom comes. All right, so I'm moving to something completely different. I'm kind of picking up the pace here because of the time. So because the biggest population that is registered for this webinar was law enforcement, I wanted to include a couple of pieces of research on law enforcement. And this was in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin in 2018. This was a study done of folks on patrol. And they were looking at what is the biggest stressor for folks on patrol. And what they found was the biggest stressor was when a person on patrol had to leave the office and go on patrol, number one, because now they had to change from being stressed about what's going on politically in the office and who's doing what to who and who's getting promoted, and now they had to get out on the street and actually do the work. That shift was high stress. But then what they found was anytime a patrol officer changed, went from case to case, it wasn't the trauma in the case. It wasn't the trauma of what happened. It was having to shift from being in a robbery 1 minute to a gruesome automobile accident in another, to a suicide in another, to a cat in a tree in another, and having to play different roles, having to be able to be the crime fighter and a social worker all at the same time. It was the changing of the cases that caused the high stress. And so this study went on to say that they took a certain number of these officers and they taught them mindfulness techniques to do in between the cases, in between the calls, and to be able to separate from the last one and not be already thinking about the next one, just to be in the moment and then be fresh to go into the next one, and how much that reduced the symptoms of PTSD and the stress level. Also, just, oh, what is this? This is another poll question. Up to you, Aaron.
Yep, and Dwayne, if in the interest of time you want to skip this question, we certainly can just drive on to the next slide.
Let's do that. I will go ahead and just tell you that for ICAC workers, that's Internet Crimes Against Children, and they're exposed to images, child sexual abuse images, child pornography. A study was done finding out how many of them were functioning well, and about 25% were not. Were showing high levels of traumatic response, and so and from my work, working with ICAC and with different officers, I find that to be true as well. And what they found that helped to support them was if their work highly supported stuff on the outside. In other words, if I need to take time off to go pick up my kid, I don't get a lot of flack at work for that. The work is supporting my need to do things on the outside if I need to do that. They also were doing things like exercise and taking breaks and all of those things that we talked about before. I'm going to move on through this stuff. So for you to take care of yourself, first of all, there's a difference between stress management and resiliency. Stress management is what you do when you're already stressed. Yes, it will bring down cortisol levels, but it will not stop them from going up again. Becoming resilient will help your cortisol levels to not go up again. Taking on a lifestyle that is resilient helps you control the amount of time you actually have a stress response or a traumatic response. And so you can get this off the website, so I'm not going to go through these, but these are, you've seen these before. These are ways to deal with stress. They work immediately, they bring down cortisol levels, they work, but your stress will come back again. They're not permanent, they just help you deal with stress as it occurs. Resilience depends on an ability of knowing yourself, having a sense of hope, knowing that you're doing this work because you want to improve things, that you're doing this work because you have a passion for it in some kind of way, having good, strong relationships that encourage you to be healthy and to be resilient, not folks who want you to, you had a rough day, let's drink this bottle of wine. No, they're going to ask you to go for a run first and then drink the bottle of wine. That's a good, strong relationship. And that you know why you're doing this work. You have the perspective and meaning for doing the work. And again, here are things, if you notice, these aren't the simple bring down your stress things. These are things like living in the present moment and expressing gratitude. These are things that you need to do consistently to build your resilience over time. Just one here, being silent. Being silent is the only time that brain cells develop. In other words, if you want to grow new brain cells, you have to have periods of silence in your day. Or don't grow new brain cells, but we need silence to do that. Mindfulness is being able to take a break from your work, and particularly during the day, if you can take just a moment to focus on your body. So one way of doing that is progressive muscle relaxation. Tighten every muscle in your body. Start with your arms and your chest and move on down. Tighten and release, tighten and release. If you're focused on that, you're not thinking about the last case. You're not thinking about the image in your head. Or breathing exercises. Focusing on your environment, connecting with all five senses to your room. What do I hear, see, taste, touch, smell in this environment? It disconnects you from what you were working on for a few minutes, kind of refuels you, lets you to connect with your environment, and then you can go back to the work. And these were the kinds of things that they encouraged the patrol officers to do in between cases, or focus on a single thing and just fully put your attention on it. Again, you're going to get this on the website. This is one full mindfulness exercise that you can do that involves breathing as well. These are things, again, you can get on the website. These are things that if you give yourself a rating for each of these and then write a sentence for yourself as to how to increase that rating by one click for each of these and then spend a month on each one, you will build your resilience. You'll also start to feel better about yourself. All those things we talked about, bringing down cortisol and that sort of thing. Again, writing a mission statement for each of these things and then checking it every 6 months to make sure you're still on task. This one is, what do you want people to say about you after you're dead? All right. I know that's kind of gruesome, but looking in retrospect, what do I want people to say about me? And am I living a lifestyle or working a professional lifestyle that allows that to happen? If you, these are some things to be aware of. If you view content, if you view gruesome images, never look at them and listen to them at the same time if they're video, and always try to spot through them first before you watch the full video. But if you get visions in your head, if you get images in your head, here's some things to do. Change them to black and white. your brain, when it sees something in color in your brain, it actually thinks it's participating in it. But if you change it to black and white in your head, your brain actually says, oh, that's not real, that's just a picture. And it actually reduces your anxiety about the picture almost immediately. If it's playing like a movie in your head, then run it backwards, forwards, put music to it in your head. Any way that you can manipulate it, the more you can manipulate it, the more your brain says, oh, this isn't worth worrying about, and it reduces your traumatic response. If you remember old TVs, when you turned them off, they used to go down to a dot, and then the dot would disappear. Well, if you've got an image in your head, don't fight it, but just say, okay, I'm done with that, and reduce it down to a dot like an old TV, and then poof, make it go away. The more you practice these things, neural networks are formed in 4 days, but habits are formed in 21 days. The more you practice these things, the easier they will become. If it is a client and a case, and you're having trouble getting past the trauma of this client, project out. So where do you think this client will be in 5 years? Where do you think this client will be in 10 years? You create the story. You create in your head the end of the story so that you can let go of the trauma. Sorry. I want to go backwards. There we go. Here are some high-risk signs. Do you have persistent images? Are they in your head and you can't get rid of them? Is it causing sexual dysfunction, particularly if you work in the field of child sexual abuse? It can cause sexual dysfunction because you're seeing this stuff all the time. Are you having dreams and nightmares? Do the thoughts or images interrupt concentrated thought? When you're concentrating on something else, does it interrupt? If so, these are high risk. You might want to think about going and talking to somebody. Go to your EAP program, find a counselor who's good with trauma or understands the work that you do. You'll only need a couple of sessions, but it will help. Here are things to think about for yourself. Where are your stressors? What are the stressors at home? What are your stressors at work? Label them, name them so you know what they are. Are you using your family and friends in a positive way to keep you balanced so that you're not always thinking about your job? Are you exercising? Do you have a hobby? Are you eating healthy? Are you sleeping well? Do you have plans for the future that you can think of to distract yourself from what's right in front of you at work occasionally? What fulfills you? And are you using the coping skills that we talked about before? Now, this is not a poll question, but I want you to think, we're almost done. I want you to think, in the justice system, between law enforcement and corrections and advocacy for the victim and the courtroom and all of the things that are involved in the justice system, who do you think gets the least support and may actually be exposed to well, they are exposed to a large amount of traumatic material? Who do you think that is? It's the jury. And so I want you, if you're in the criminal system, if you're in the court system, I want you to think about, what is the jury exposed to? They see pictures, they hear stories over and over and over again, and yet there's no mental health support for them. It's sort of, thank you for your service, and they're sent on their way. So if you interact with jury members or whatever, be aware of that and take an extra minute to talk to them, to help support them in this system. All right, I'm not sure what, oh, okay, this is the last thing. Just want to show you, those of you that still think the job is not affecting you and that you're not stressed or you're not having a traumatic response, I'm going to prove it to you. This is a stress test that says that if you look at something soothing and you see the same picture side by side and you see differences between the pictures, you're stressed. The more differences you see, the more stressed you are. So we're going to look at a picture of a dolphin in water, very soothing. It's actually the same picture side by side of this dolphin, okay? If you see differences, you're stressed. The more differences you see, the more stressed you are. Is anybody stressed? And that's one of my favorite pictures. I actually had somebody once say to me, I don't know what you're all laughing at. All I see is 2 cows. And my stress level went up. So Aaron, are there any questions that we can answer perhaps quickly in the next couple of minutes?
I love psychology humor, Dwayne. Thank you so much. You did an amazing job, as always, with this webinar. I did want to let folks know that on July 18th, we have our next webinar with Dwayne. The topic is the impact of trauma on child development, what justice professionals need to know. Dwayne, and we do have a number of questions. We only have time for a few questions here. Are you ready for them?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So Melissa asks the first question, are there any professional services that specifically support justice professionals besides just a personal therapist?
Yes, there's an organization known as, and there are several, but the one I'm going to tell you about is the one I know the best. It's called Shift. Go on the website, go on the internet, and search out Shift, SHIFT. They work primarily with law enforcement, and that includes federal agencies as well as local agencies. They do a lot of education. They don't do one-to-one kind of therapy or working one-to-one with folks, but they do a lot of really good education. They've got some good handouts too. They've got a really good handout on how to support the families of law enforcement who may be exposed to trauma. So I would suggest them. There are more and more law enforcement agencies are actually including wellness programs and whatever, but honestly, they're pretty much therapists like me that just have been exposed to trauma or been exposed to law enforcement work, and so we kind of get it. You know, most, I don't mean this the way it's going to sound, but most therapists, if they haven't really been exposed to boots on the ground trauma, they're not going to be real supportive. If they've sat in their office and they've had the trauma come to them, I'm going to suggest to you that that's probably not the best therapist. You need someone who really does go out there in the field, who really does work with folks in the field, law enforcement or victims or whatever out in the field. EAP programs are okay, but I want you to think about EAPs. Who is it that's an EAP provider? It's usually somebody new to the field who is just trying to build their practice. So they're not going to have a lot of background perhaps in trauma. Now that's just a gross generalization, I realize that. But you just kind of want to be careful who you connect to. You want to make sure they have a lot of good trauma background. So try Shift and look at their website and look at what they have to offer as far as an organized group. And that's the only one I can think of in the moment. I know there's more out there, but that's the one I can think of.
Thanks, Dwayne. Yep, I actually found them, Shift Wellness. So it's shiftwellness.net is the website, and I will try to include a link on the course page. We also work with an organization called the Counseling Team International. They're out of California. They do a great job too. Next question is from Felicia. In your opinion, do you think a law enforcement officer that investigates a tragic homicide and then attends the funeral might be overinvested?
That's a good question, but it's one that can't be answered without knowing the individual. Some people going to the funeral actually closes the case for them, and they can let it go and move on, and so it's a good thing. Other people may be so invested in the case they need to continue the relationship, and they're going to the funeral because they need that continued relationship, and that's not particularly healthy. So you got to know the individual and why they're, talk to them about why they're doing it. If you have an individual who tends to do it with every case or does it pretty consistently, I would suggest they're probably doing it as a way of closing off that case for themselves and being able to let it go, put it away, move on. But you really have to know the individual to figure out what is the purpose of them attending. And if it's to maintain that relationship in some kind of way, then that's not healthy. But if it's to close it up and move on, yeah, that's probably not a bad technique.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from John. He asks, do you have any similar data as what you showed for law enforcement officers for or involving 911 dispatchers, especially regarding stressors? And he goes on to explain that telecommunicators are the ones who hear and read the trauma. They don't see it, but they certainly experience it.
Oh, absolutely. And I do a lot of work with National Center for Missing Exploited Children and actually provide support for their call center as well. Absolutely. And not only are you getting the story firsthand, you're getting it when it's raw, you're getting it when the people are emotional, and then you're also getting what we professionally refer to as sometimes the crazies that are calling in, and you can't tell, is this real, is it not, whatever. So I'm with you. I don't have statistics, but I do know they're out there. I do know there has been some studies done with call centers recently, and I mean within the last 5 to 7 years. Maybe do some searching. I'll try to do some searching, and if I find any, I'll let Aaron know, and he can put that link on as well. There is research out there. I can tell you that for sure. I'm not sure where it is.
Great, Dwayne, thank you so much for that, and I'll look for your email. Last question is from Cassandra. Does silence while sleeping count, or does it need to be a period of silence while awake?
No, it can be while you're asleep as well. It's just silence. The research came from lab rats, and they played different kinds of music trying to see what stimulated the brain. And what they found was it wasn't the music that stimulated the brain, it was the quiet time in between that stimulated the brain growth. So it's just quiet time, not watching a movie, not reading a book, but quiet time, sitting, I'm going to say meditation, but just sitting with your thoughts, being quiet. Maybe music, but not music that you're singing with or dancing with. Just quiet time to allow your brain to grow. And it can be sleep as well as waking time.
Dwayne, thank you so much for an incredible webinar again today. You hit it out of the park every single time. Before we close out, I'll give you the final word.
Oh, take care of yourself. You are responsible for your self-care. You have to do that. It would be nice if your agency helped with your wellness, but if they don't, take it on. Do not allow yourself to become one of those people that when they retire, they didn't take care of themselves during their employment, and they start to have difficulty after retiring. Don't become that. You have full control over the traumatic response. Take advantage of it. Take care of it now. It's in your province to do that. Do it. Take care of yourself.
Thanks so much, Dwayne. I echo the sentiment. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And this concludes today's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Have a great rest of your week and enjoy your long weekend. Bye, everyone.